Here's what nobody tells international closers. You can have perfect grammar, flawless pronunciation, and zero accent. But if you don't know the difference between investment and cost, between partnership and deal, between exclusive and limited, you'll never close like a native. I've worked with closers who spoke better English than most Americans but couldn't break $100,000 because they were missing the secret sales vocabulary that turns prospects into buyers. Today, I'm breaking down why mastering the right words and phrases can separate amateur international closers from the pros earning multiple six figures in English-speaking markets. Most international closers think they speak perfect English until they hear a recording of their last failed sales call. There's something wrong with the way they sound, something that makes prospects immediately think foreign salesperson instead of trusted advisor. The problem isn't your accent or your grammar, it's something much more subtle and much more dangerous. International closers use textbook English in high-stakes sales situations. They say things like, "This product is very good," instead of, "This solution delivers exceptional value." They ask, "Do you want to buy this?" instead of, "Are you ready to move forward with this investment?" They sound like they learned English from a business course, not from the real world of high-ticket sales. Your prospects categorize you as foreign based on specific word choices, not your accent. I've worked with closers who sound more American than most Americans, but they still struggle to close because they use the wrong vocabulary. When you say expensive instead of premium, when you say customer instead of client, when you say product instead of solution, you're sending signals that you don't belong in the high-ticket sales world. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Amateur international closers say, "This costs $10,000. Professional closers say, "The investment is $10,000. Amateur closers say, "You should buy this because it's good quality." Professional closers say, "This represents exceptional value given the ROI potential." Amateur closers say, "Many people like this product." Professional closers say, "Our clients consistently report significant results." See how different these sound? The amateur version makes you sound like someone selling widgets. The professional version makes you sound like someone managing investments. When you say "buy my product" instead of "make this investment," you destroy trust immediately. The word "buy" makes prospects think about spending money. The word "investment" makes them think about returns. The word "product" makes them think about commodities. The word "solution" makes them think about outcomes. These aren't just different words. They create completely different psychological responses in your prospect's mind. Your prospects test your market knowledge through linguistic cues without even knowing they're doing it. When you use amateur vocabulary, they subconsciously think, "This person doesn't understand my world." When you use professional vocabulary, they think, "This person gets it." A CEO doesn't want to hear about your cheap option. They want to hear about your cost-effective solution. A business owner doesn't want to hear about problems. They want to hear about challenges and opportunities. Perfect grammar means nothing if you lack sales-specific vocabulary. You can conjugate every verb correctly and still sound like an amateur. You can pronounce every word perfectly and still lose credibility. I've seen international closers with PhD-level English skills who couldn't close a high-ticket sale because they didn't know the difference between purchase and acquisition, between meeting and consultation, between price and investment. This vocabulary gap creates an invisible ceiling on your income potential. When prospects hear amateur language, they assume amateur prices. When they hear professional language, they expect professional prices. The closers earning $100,000 don't just know English. They know sales English. They know the exact words that make prospects feel comfortable spending serious money. The vocabulary barrier gets worse under pressure. When the stakes are high and you're trying to close a $50,000 deal, you revert to the vocabulary you know best. If that vocabulary is textbook English instead of sales English, you'll sound like someone who doesn't belong in that conversation. Your prospect will sense it immediately. Most international closers think vocabulary is just about knowing more words. That's wrong. It's about knowing the right words for the right situation. It's about understanding that in high-ticket sales, every word choice either builds or destroys credibility. When you say guarantee instead of assurance, when you say features instead of benefits, when you say contract instead of agreement, you're pushing prospects away. The difference between amateur and professional vocabulary isn't subtle, it's massive. Amateur closers talk about selling products. Professional closers talk about delivering solutions. Amateur closers discuss prices. Professional closers discuss investment levels. Amateur closers mention customers. Professional closers mention clients and partners. Your credibility comes from using the exact words your prospects expect to hear from experts. When they hear the right vocabulary, they assume you have the right expertise. When they hear the wrong vocabulary, they assume you don't. It's that simple and that powerful. This vocabulary barrier manifests in every sales conversation you have. It shows up when you present your offer, when you handle objections, when you ask for the close. Each time you use amateur vocabulary instead of professional vocabulary, you're telling your prospect that you don't belong in their world of high-ticket purchases. There's a secret sales language that American closers learn naturally, but international closers never discover. This isn't about grammar or pronunciation, it's about a whole vocabulary that native speakers absorb without even trying. They learn it from movies, TV shows, business conversations, and everyday interactions. By the time they start selling, they already know hundreds of sales expressions that sound natural to English-speaking prospects. Native speakers absorb sales idioms from childhood through media and culture. They watch movies where characters talk about closing deals and sealing the deal. They hear business conversations where people discuss moving the needle and low-hanging fruit. They grow up with these expressions in their ears. When they start selling, they don't have to learn this vocabulary. They already know it. They use it naturally because it's part of their cultural DNA. International closers learn formal English but miss the nuanced sales expressions that actually matter in high-ticket sales. You study grammar rules and vocabulary lists. You learn to say, I would like to present you with our premium solution. But you never learn to say, let's explore what success looks like for your organization. You learn textbook English instead of sales English. You sound correct but not natural. American closers use expressions that international closers completely miss. They say, let's circle back on this instead of let's discuss this again later. They say, we need to move the needle instead of we need to make significant progress. They say, this is the low-hanging fruit instead of this is the easy opportunity. These aren't just different ways of saying the same thing. They carry cultural weight that makes prospects feel comfortable. The phrase move the needle comes from the idea of making a measurable impact, like moving a gauge or meter. When American closers say this, prospects immediately understand they're talking about significant, measurable results. The phrase low-hanging fruit draws from the concept of easily attainable goals. These expressions aren't just linguistic tools. They're cultural touchstones that convey meaning in a way that textbook English cannot. American closers use metaphors and analogies that feel natural to English-speaking prospects. They talk about hitting a home run when discussing big wins. They mention touching base when they want to follow up. They say we're on the same page when confirming understanding. These sports and business metaphors resonate because they're part of American culture. When you use them correctly, prospects feel like they're talking to someone who understands their world. The psychological impact of using familiar versus unfamiliar language patterns is massive in sales. When prospects hear language they understand and relate to, they relax. Their guard comes down. They start thinking this person gets it instead of this person sounds different. When you use unfamiliar patterns, even if they're grammatically correct, prospects feel distance. They sense you're not from their world. International closers face linguistic barriers that prevent them from competing at the highest levels. You might know thousands of English words, but you don't know the right 50 words for high-ticket sales. You can construct perfect sentences, but you can't construct the sentences that make prospects want to buy. You understand English, but you don't understand the emotional triggers that English-speaking prospects respond to. These barriers show up in every conversation. When American closers say, what's driving this decision? International closers say, what is the reason for this decision? When American closers say, let's talk about your pain points. International closers say, let's discuss your problems. When American closers say, we can scale this solution, international closers say, we can make this bigger. Same meaning, completely different impact. The cultural context behind these expressions matters more than the words themselves. When an American closer says, let's take this offline, they're not just suggesting a private conversation. They're using language that signals insider knowledge of business culture. When they say, let's get granular, they're not just asking for details. They're speaking the language of executives and decision makers. American closers leverage shared cultural references that international closers miss entirely. They make references to American sports, business practices, and cultural norms that feel natural to prospects. They use idioms that have been part of American business culture for decades. This creates an instant connection that international closers struggle to replicate. The gap between knowing English and knowing sales English creates an invisible ceiling for international closers. You can communicate clearly, but you can't communicate persuasively. You can be understood, but you can't be influential. The difference isn't about being fluent in English. It's about being fluent in the specific English that makes prospects comfortable spending serious money. These linguistic gaps separate international closers from native level performance in measurable ways. Native speakers don't just sound different, they trigger different responses, they create different feelings, they build different levels of trust. When prospects hear native level sales vocabulary, they assume native level expertise. The specific words and phrases that create these barriers are learnable, but only if you know exactly which ones matter most. I'm about to show you a selection of words that can double your closing rate in the next 30 days. These aren't random vocabulary words. These are the specific terms that high-ticket closers use to sound like experts instead of salespeople. When you master these words, prospects stop seeing you as someone trying to sell them something and start seeing you as someone who understands their world. High-impact vocabulary transforms average closers into top performers in ways that most people don't understand. It's not about sounding smart or using big words. It's about using the right words that make prospects feel comfortable spending serious money. The closers earning $100,000 know these words instinctively. They use them naturally in every conversation. When you start using them, you'll sound like you belong in their league. Most international closers know thousands of English words but are missing these crucial ones that actually matter in sales. You might know 10,000 English words, but if you don't know the difference between cost and investment, between meeting and consultation, between problem and challenge, you'll never close like a native. These specific words are the difference between sounding like a textbook and sounding like a professional. Let me show you specific high-ticket sales words that instantly elevate your perceived expertise. Instead of saying expensive, you say investment grade or premium positioning. Instead of saying cheap, you say cost-effective or value optimized. Instead of saying problems, you say challenges or opportunities. Instead of saying features, you say capabilities or benefits. Each word choice signals to prospects that you understand their world of high-level business decisions. The difference between saying expensive versus investment grade or premium positioning completely changes how prospects perceive your offer. When you say expensive, prospects think about money leaving their account. When you say investment grade, they think about returns and value. When you say premium positioning, they think about status and exclusivity. Same concept, totally different psychological impact. The word expensive makes them want to negotiate down. The phrase investment grade makes them want to understand the returns. American closers use rapport-building expressions unconsciously that international closers never learn. They say, let's explore what success looks like instead of, let's talk about what you want. They say, I'm curious about your perspective instead of, what do you think? They say, that's a great question instead of, yes, I understand. These expressions create connection and make prospects feel heard and understood. These words trigger different psychological responses in prospects' minds that directly impact your closing rate. When you say solution instead of product, prospects think about outcomes instead of features. When you say partner instead of vendor, they think about relationships instead of transactions. When you say consultation instead of meeting, they think about expertise instead of sales calls. Each word choice moves them closer to buying or further away from buying. The words you use to handle objections matter just as much as the words you use to present your offer. Instead of saying, that's not true, you say, I understand your concern. Instead of saying, you're wrong, you say, that's an interesting perspective. Instead of saying, let me convince you, you say, let me share some additional context. These subtle changes keep prospects engaged instead of defensive. When prospects say they need to think about it, amateur closers say, what do you need to think about? Professional closers say, what additional information would help you move forward confidently? When prospects say the price is too high, amateur closers say, I can give you a discount. Professional closers say, let's explore the investment relative to the projected returns. Same objection, completely different response strategy. The way you ask for the close reveals everything about your vocabulary level. Amateur closers say, do you want to buy this? Professional closers say, are you ready to move forward? Amateur closers say, can you afford this? Professional closers say, does this align with your budget parameters? Amateur closers say, when will you decide? Professional closers say, what's your decision timeline? Your vocabulary affects how prospects perceive your prices before you even mention numbers. When you use professional vocabulary throughout the conversation, prospects expect professional pricing. When you use amateur vocabulary, they expect amateur pricing. The words you use in the first 5 minutes of a conversation determine whether prospects will accept high-ticket pricing or negotiate you down. These 50 words create compound effects throughout your sales conversations. Each professional word choice builds on the previous one. By the end of the conversation, prospects either see you as an an expert worth paying premium prices or as an amateur who should offer discounts. The cumulative effect of vocabulary choices determines your closing rate more than any other factor. The transformative power of precise vocabulary choices becomes obvious once you start using these words consistently. Prospects respond differently to you. They ask different questions. They raise different objections. They make decisions faster. Your entire sales experience changes when you sound like someone who belongs in high-ticket sales conversations. Mastering these expressions creates the foundation for native-level sales conversations that generate consistent six-figure income. But knowing the words isn't enough. You need to understand exactly when and how to use them naturally in real conversations. You can memorize every sales word in the dictionary, but if you use them wrong, you'll sound like a robot reading from a script. I've heard international closers use words like synergy and optimization in situations where they made no sense at all. They thought using sophisticated vocabulary would make them sound professional. Instead, they sounded like someone who learned English from a business textbook instead of real conversations. Traditional vocabulary learning methods fail in sales contexts because they focus on memorizing definitions instead of understanding usage. You sit with flashcards trying to remember that leverage means to use something effectively, but you don't learn that saying let's leverage this opportunity sounds natural while let's leverage your budget sounds weird. Flashcards teach you what words mean. They don't teach you when to use them or how they feel to native speakers. Using sophisticated words in wrong contexts actually hurts your credibility more than using simple words correctly. When you say, let's optimize your pain points, you sound like someone who doesn't understand how English works. When you say, we need to leverage this synergy, you sound like a parody of a business person. Your prospect thinks you're trying too hard to sound smart instead of actually being helpful. The difference between knowing a word and knowing when to use it naturally is massive in sales conversations. You might know that facilitate means to make something easier, but you don't know that saying I'll facilitate your purchase sounds robotic while I'll help you move forward sounds natural. You know the definition, but you don't know the feeling. Native speakers choose words based on how they feel, not what they mean. Contextual usage drills transform awkward phrasing into smooth conversations by showing you exactly when and how to use specific words. Instead of memorizing that investment sounds better than cost, you practice using investment in 10 different sales situations. You learn to say the investment is $10,000 when presenting pricing. You learn to say what's your investment timeline when qualifying prospects. You learn to say this represents a solid investment when handling objections. Same word, different contexts, different results. Let me show you how the same word changes meaning in different sales situations. The word solution works perfectly when you say, we've developed a solution for companies like yours, but it sounds wrong when you say, what's your solution to this problem? The word partnership works when you say, we're looking for a long-term partnership, but it sounds pushy when you say, are you ready for this partnership? Native speakers know these distinctions instinctively. International closers have to learn them consciously. The word opportunity changes completely based on context. When you say, this is a great opportunity for your business, it sounds professional. When you say, I have an opportunity to show you, it sounds like you're selling something. When you say, let's explore this opportunity together, it sounds collaborative. Same word, 3 different feelings, 3 different results. Timing and context matter more than vocabulary size because prospects respond to how words feel, not what they mean. You can know 50,000 English words, but if you use them at the wrong time or in the wrong way, you'll sound foreign. Native speakers use simple words at the right time instead of complex words at the wrong time. They say, let's talk about this, instead of let's facilitate a discussion regarding this matter. Native speakers intuitively know when to use certain expressions because they've heard them in context thousands of times. They know that let's circle back works in business situations, but let's return to this topic sounds formal. They know that what's driving this decision works in sales, but what's motivating this choice sounds academic. They don't think about these choices, they feel them. The intuitive understanding comes from exposure to real conversations, not vocabulary lists. American closers hear these expressions used correctly in movies, TV shows, business meetings, and casual conversations. They absorb the context along with the words. International closers learn words in isolation without the cultural context that makes them work naturally. When you use contextual drills, you start developing the same intuitive understanding that native speakers have. You practice using challenge instead of problem in specific situations until it feels natural. You practice using investment instead of cost in different contexts until you know exactly when it works. You develop the feeling for English that makes your vocabulary choices sound natural instead of forced. The key difference between memorizing vocabulary and mastering contextual usage is that memorization teaches you what words mean, while contextual practice teaches you how words feel. Prospects don't just understand your words, they feel them. When your word choices feel natural, prospects relax and trust you. When they feel forced or awkward, prospects become suspicious and defensive. Contextual mastery is the key to natural-sounding sales conversations that build trust instead of destroying it. But developing this mastery requires specific training methods that focus on usage patterns instead of definitions. You need to practice using words in realistic sales situations until they become automatic responses. Here's the training method that top international closers use to think in English during high-pressure sales calls. When the stakes are high and you're trying to close a $50,000 deal, your brain doesn't have time to translate from your native language. You need automatic responses. You need the right words to flow naturally without conscious effort. The closers who master this skill never struggle with vocabulary under pressure because they've trained their brains to respond automatically in English. The biggest problem international closers face is reverting to native language patterns under pressure. You practice your vocabulary when you're relaxed and focused, but when you're on a live sales call with a high-value prospect, stress kicks in. Your sophisticated vocabulary disappears. You start using simple words and basic sentence structures. You sound like a beginner again, even though you know advanced vocabulary. This happens because stress blocks access to your learned vocabulary and forces your brain back to its comfort zone. Stress causes international closers to lose their sophisticated vocabulary exactly when they need it most. During high-stakes conversations, your brain triggers a fight-or-flight response. This response prioritizes speed over sophistication. Your mind reaches for the words it knows best, which are usually the basic words you learned first. The advanced sales vocabulary you studied gets buried under stress. You end up saying, "This costs a lot," instead of "This represents a significant investment," because your brain chooses familiar words over professional ones. Active recall exercises create automatic responses in high-stakes situations by forcing your brain to retrieve vocabulary under pressure. Instead of reading vocabulary lists passively, you practice pulling words from memory quickly. You train your brain to access professional vocabulary even when you're stressed. This process creates neural pathways that bypass the conscious translation process. When you need the word investment during a sales call, it comes automatically instead of requiring mental effort to remember. Let me show you specific drills that build vocabulary muscle memory for sales conversations. First, you create scenarios where you need to use specific words under time pressure. You practice responding to common sales situations using only professional vocabulary. For example, when someone says "that's too expensive," you practice automatic responses like "let's explore the ROI potential," or "help me understand your budget parameters." You drill these responses until they become natural reflexes. The second drill involves vocabulary switching exercises. You take basic sales conversations and rewrite them using professional vocabulary. Then you practice delivering these conversations out loud until the professional version feels more natural than the basic version. You train your mouth muscles and your brain simultaneously. The physical act of speaking professional vocabulary repeatedly creates muscle memory that works even under stress. The science behind why active recall works better than passive study methods is simple but powerful. When you read vocabulary lists, you're using recognition memory. When you practice retrieving words from memory, you're using recall memory. Recall memory is much stronger and more reliable under stress. Recognition memory fails when you're nervous, but recall memory stays strong. Active recall literally rewires your brain to access vocabulary automatically instead of consciously. Vocabulary quizzes and contextual drills create neural pathways for natural speech by forcing your brain to connect words with situations. You don't just memorize definitions. You practice using words in realistic contexts repeatedly. Your brain starts associating specific situations with specific vocabulary choices. When you encounter similar situations in real sales calls, the appropriate vocabulary activates automatically. This process transforms conscious vocabulary choices into unconscious habits. The neural pathways created through active recall become stronger with each repetition. Every time you successfully retrieve a word from memory during practice, you strengthen the connection between that word and its usage context. After enough repetitions, using professional vocabulary becomes easier than using basic vocabulary. Your brain develops a preference for sophisticated language because it's been practiced more frequently than simple language. The transformation from conscious effort to unconscious mastery happens gradually through systematic practice. At first, you have to think about using professional vocabulary. You consciously choose investment instead of cost. But after weeks of active recall practice, professional vocabulary becomes your default choice. You stop thinking about vocabulary and start thinking about results. Your language becomes sophisticated automatically, which frees your mental energy for more important tasks like reading prospect reactions and adjusting your approach. This transformation is obvious when you compare recordings of your sales calls before and after active recall training. Before training, you pause to think about word choices. You sound hesitant and uncertain. After training, professional vocabulary flows naturally. You sound confident and authoritative. Prospects respond differently to you because you sound like someone who belongs in high-ticket sales conversations. Systematic practice transforms vocabulary knowledge into natural speech patterns that work under any level of pressure. You develop the same automatic responses that native speakers have. When prospects ask difficult questions or raise serious objections, you respond with professional vocabulary without conscious efforts. This automatic mastery is what separates six-figure closers from everyone else. The real-world results of implementing this training approach become visible within weeks of consistent practice. Let me show you exactly what happens when an international closer masters native-level sales vocabulary. The transformation is dramatic and immediate. Within weeks of implementing proper vocabulary training, closers sound completely different on sales calls. Their confidence increases because they're no longer searching for words or worried about sounding foreign. Prospects respond to them as experts instead of salespeople. The change affects every aspect of their sales performance. The transformation from awkward phrasing to authoritative communication happens in stages. First, you notice you're using professional vocabulary automatically instead of thinking about it. Words like investment and solution start feeling more natural than cost and product. Then you realize you're handling objections with sophisticated language that keeps prospects engaged instead of defensive. Finally, you start closing deals that would have been impossible before because you sound like someone who belongs in high-ticket sales conversations. When vocabulary mastery takes hold, specific changes occur in every sales interaction. Your opening conversations become smoother because you're using language that prospects expect to hear from professionals. Your presentations sound more authoritative because you're describing benefits instead of features, solutions instead of products, investments instead of costs. Your closing conversations become more natural because you're using language that makes prospects comfortable with big decisions. Let me show you concrete examples of before and after conversations. Before vocabulary training, an international closer might say, "This product costs $10,000, but it's very good quality and will help solve your problems. Many customers like it and you should buy it because it will save you money." After training, the same closer says, "This solution represents a $10,000 investment that addresses your specific challenges. Our clients consistently report significant ROI, and this positions your organization for sustainable growth." The difference is obvious. The first version sounds like someone selling a commodity. The second version sounds like someone presenting a strategic business opportunity. Same information, completely different impact. Prospects respond to the second version as a professional consultation instead of a sales pitch. Here's another example. Before training, "I understand you think it's expensive, but the price is fair and I can maybe give you a small discount if you buy today." After training, "I appreciate your concern about the investment level. Let's explore the projected ROI relative to your current operational costs. What specific outcomes would justify this investment for your organization?" The before version makes you sound desperate and unprofessional. The after version makes you sound like a consultant helping them make a smart business decision. Prospects engage with the second approach because it feels collaborative instead of pushy. Prospects respond differently to native-level vocabulary and phrasing in measurable ways. They ask more intelligent questions because they perceive you as someone worth having a serious conversation with. They share more information about their business because you sound like someone who would understand their challenges. They discuss budget more openly because you sound like someone who deals with serious investments regularly. The psychological shift that occurs when you speak like a native sales professional affects your entire approach to selling. You stop feeling like you're trying to convince people to buy something. You start feeling like you're helping them make important business decisions. This shift in mindset comes through in your voice, your body language, and your entire sales process. Prospects sense this confidence and respond accordingly. When you sound professional, Prospects assume you have professional expertise. When you sound amateur, they assume you have amateur knowledge. This assumption affects how they evaluate your offer, how they respond to your questions, and how seriously they consider your recommendations. Professional vocabulary creates professional credibility that directly impacts your closing rate. Increased credibility leads to stronger rapport and higher closing rates through a simple psychological mechanism. When prospects trust your expertise, they're more likely to trust your recommendations. When they trust your recommendations, they're more likely to act on them. Professional vocabulary creates this trust automatically because it signals insider knowledge and market experience. The income potential that unlocks with native-level communication skills is significant. Closers who master professional vocabulary consistently close higher-ticket deals because they sound like someone who belongs in those conversations. They also close deals faster because prospects don't need to be convinced of their credibility. The vocabulary does the credibility building automatically. I've seen international closers increase their income by 200% or more within 6 months of mastering professional sales vocabulary. Not because they learned new sales techniques, but because they finally sounded like professionals. Their closing rate improved, their average deal size increased, and their sales cycle shortened. All because they learned to speak like native sales professionals. Speaking like a native sales professional transforms your entire professional identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who speaks English as a second language. You start seeing yourself as a professional who happens to be bilingual. This identity shift affects how you present yourself, how you negotiate, and how you position your services. You become more confident in every professional interaction. The long-term benefits of vocabulary mastery in English-speaking markets extend far beyond individual sales conversations and create lasting competitive advantages. The closers earning $100,000 in English-speaking markets all follow this exact vocabulary development system. They don't randomly collect words or hope that exposure will improve their language. They use a structured approach that builds native-level sales vocabulary systematically. This system transforms amateur international closers into professional-sounding experts within months, not years. The systematic approach to building native-level sales vocabulary involves 3 specific phases that build on each other. First, you establish a foundation with targeted vocabulary acquisition. Then you develop practical application skills through contextual usage. Finally, you achieve mastery through automated recall training. Each phase serves a specific purpose in transforming your sales language from textbook English to professional sales English. Random vocabulary learning fails because it lacks focus and context. Most international closers collect words without understanding their sales applications. They learn, facilitate, and optimize, but don't know when these words sound natural in sales conversations. Strategic sales-focused language development targets the exact words that matter in high-ticket sales situations. You learn fewer words but master them completely. The specific steps start with flashcards for foundation building. You create flashcards with essential sales words on one side and their natural usage context on the other. Instead of memorizing definitions, you memorize usage patterns. For example, your flashcard doesn't just say investment means money put into something. It shows you when to say the investment is $10,000 versus this represents a solid investment versus what's your investment timeline. You learn the word in context from the beginning. Contextual drills represent the application phase where you practice using vocabulary in realistic sales scenarios. You role-play common sales situations using only professional vocabulary. When someone says that's too expensive, you practice responding with, let's explore the investment relative to the projected returns until it becomes automatic. You drill specific usage patterns until professional responses feel more natural than amateur ones. Active recall exercises create mastery by forcing your brain to retrieve vocabulary under pressure. You practice pulling the right words from memory quickly during simulated sales conversations. This creates the neural pathways that make professional vocabulary available even when you're stressed or under time pressure. The goal is automatic access to sophisticated language without conscious effort. Daily practice sessions should be structured for maximum vocabulary retention. Spend 15 minutes on flashcard review, focusing on words you struggle with most. Then spend 20 minutes on contextual drills, practicing specific sales scenarios. Finally, spend 10 minutes on active recall exercises where you respond to sales situations without preparation. This 45-minute routine builds vocabulary systematically when done consistently. You measure progress by recording yourself during practice sessions and tracking specific improvements. Listen for moments when you use professional vocabulary naturally instead of basic words. Count how many times you use investment instead of cost or solution instead of product. Track your response time when handling objections with sophisticated language. These metrics show you exactly exactly where your vocabulary is improving. Adjust your training approach based on these results. If you're still using expensive instead of premium or investment grade, spend more time on those specific word substitutions. If you're struggling with natural delivery, increase your contextual drill time. If you're forgetting words under pressure, add more active recall exercises. The system adapts to your specific weaknesses. Vocabulary expansion integrates with overall sales skill development by supporting every aspect of your sales process. Better vocabulary improves your qualifying questions, your presentations, your objection handling, and your closing techniques. When you ask what's driving this decision instead of why do you want this, you sound more professional and get better information. Professional vocabulary enhances every sales skill you already have. The compounding benefits of consistent vocabulary practice create exponential improvements over time. Each new word you master makes the next word easier to learn. Each professional conversation makes the next one smoother. Each successful close using sophisticated vocabulary builds confidence for bigger deals. Your vocabulary growth accelerates because professional language becomes your default mode of communication. This complete roadmap transforms your sales vocabulary from amateur to professional level through systematic progression. You start with basic word substitutions, develop contextual usage skills, and achieve automatic recall under pressure. The process takes months of consistent practice, but the results last forever. Once you master professional sales vocabulary, you never sound amateur again. The transformation happens gradually, then suddenly. For weeks, you practice diligently without seeing dramatic changes. Then one day you realize you're using professional vocabulary automatically in every conversation. Prospects respond differently. Your confidence increases, your closing rate improves. You sound like someone who belongs in high-ticket sales. Taking immediate action on vocabulary development means starting with the most impactful word substitutions today. These simple changes create immediate improvements while you develop more sophisticated vocabulary skills. Your vocabulary is your income ceiling. Expand one and you'll expand the other. The international closers earning six figures didn't just learn English. They mastered the specific words that make prospects comfortable spending serious money. Start with these essential words today and commit to 30 days of contextual practice. Practice using professional vocabulary until it becomes automatic. Every sophisticated word you master moves you closer to native level closing success. Your vocabulary determines whether prospects see you as an expert or an amateur.